Welcome back to another episode of the Canadian Immigration Podcast. I'm Mark Holthe, and this is my fearless compadre, Alicia Backman-Bahari. How are you, Alicia?
I'm doing well, Mark. We're running with all hands on deck these days.
Indeed, it is a very, very busy time within our practice and within immigration, including our dear Minister Miller and some of the decisions he's making and the future of basically immigration in Canada. This is a real turning point, especially as we close in on an election and whether or not immigration itself is going to become some kind of a wedge issue in that election. But the minister right now has made a number of different announcements. One of them, if I flip my screen over here for those who are watching this through the YouTube channel, yesterday, actually March 21st, he had delivered a speech which just got released, the speaking notes recently, on some of the intentions, the rationale, what they're planning on doing. And I'll be honest, Alicia, this really, really looks like they're planning to rip the Band-Aid off. And today what we're going to do, you guys, is we're just going to go through kind of a list of our not top 10, but just some key takeaways that you absolutely need to know and understand as you plan your future, and whether or not, one, you even decide to come to Canada, or two, what your options are and what you can do now to position yourself to hopefully get one of those precious spots for permanent residence. And I guess three, even on the whole temporary resident side, where we're at with that whole world of temporary residence, that's work permits, study permits, and where the minister is headed. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, let's slide over here, Alicia. And right off the bat, the first one on our list is the breakdown of the TR numbers by category. So do you want to share with the listeners and the viewers where we're at right now in terms of the breakdown of temporary residence in Canada?
And this is one of the reasons I thought that Minister Miller's speech was so interesting, was because we can see that they are analyzing this and they're looking at what they're going to be doing for the rest of this year and for next year. And so they have taken a look and they said, well, wait a minute, our temporary residence numbers. So just like Mark said, anybody who's here on a work permit, anybody who's here as a visitor, anybody here who's here on a visitor status. So that could be an actual visitor record, or it could be, you've just come in and you're visiting if you're a US citizen or something like that where you're visa exempt. So they've taken a look and they see a huge amount of different categories of people who are not under the levels plan, right? Because the levels plan only looks at permanent residents. And they're saying, okay, where are we at on temporary residents? So they said, right now we've got temporary resident numbers, 42% are international students. So we have this giant amount of temporary residents who are here on study permits as international students. The next thing is they have a fairly small amount, 9% here under the temporary foreign worker program. So this is anybody whose employer has gone and received an LMIA, and then the person has applied for an employer-specific LMIA-based work permit. 44%, and that's a big umbrella number, this is going to be anybody who's under the International Mobility Program. So not under the temporary foreign worker program with an LMIA. It's somebody who has an LMIA exemption. It includes a lot of different people. So that's your postgrad work permit holders, spousal work permits for students or workers, people under IEC programs, people under CUAET, so the Kuwait Ukrainian pathways. There's a lot of different folks that are falling under this 44% umbrella. And then they give you a further breakdown. So 26% are postgrad work permit holders, so people who've completed their studies, then have applied and were in an eligible program for a PGWP. 9% are spouses of students, and so we'll talk about this really soon because we know that that number is going to start shrinking drastically. 10% are part of reciprocal exchanges, so IEC, and if you had asked me, I don't think immigration can really reduce that figure because it's
No.
reciprocal with another country. So those youth exchange programs, those are probably going to be okay because it's a bilateral international agreement. 12% spouses of skilled workers, and hopefully those will also not be cut because it's somebody who has to have proven that they are working. The principal applicant is working, and then the spouse proves that they are coming.
And one
And
thing,
then
Alicia, I want to point out with this is they could
mhm,
very well, one of the things, one of the areas where I could see them changing this is moving it back to high skill workers. So
mhm.
spouses of anyone at a tier 3 or higher are the only ones eligible. They could easily do that because it was only recently that they expanded it to include spouses of all work permit holders, who had job offers. So it would
Yeah.
not surprise me at all if low wage or low skill individuals are not going to be able to bring their spouses, but we'll see.
hmm Because again, that's just a temporary policy, right? So they just allowed that recently, but you're right, Mark, they could take it away. So it might only be high skilled or high wage workers who have a job and are working in Canada that have the ability to bring their spouse under an open spousal work permit. 26% arrivals, I think this is now going to get clamped down upon as well because we're looking at people who are coming under CUET visas or other humanitarian pathways. And it says that number is growing. And
Yeah.
whenever immigration looks and they see a stream that's starting to grow significantly and they are wanting to clamp down, there's probably going to be adjustments that they're going to make for that.
Yep.
And then we've got 17% intercompany transfers, trade agreements. Those ones, those are largely labor market driven. And everything that we're hearing from the minister is they want to tie those temporary figures, the temporary residents in Canada, they want to make sure whoever's here temporarily, there is a darn good economic reason for them to be here. And so I don't think they're going to be touching the
Oh, one
that
second.
are Canadian and US or international and Canadian that are moving employees back and forth. So, and then the last one is asylum seekers, and that's a 5% on the asylum seekers, which, Minister Miller is talking about what's going on globally, and it is possible that that asylum seeker figure might decrease as well.
Alicia, are you surprised that the temporary foreign worker program only comprises 9% of this total allotment? I was
hmm
actually quite surprised with this.
hmm
And I guess when you're looking at overall work permit numbers, that is, if we were just looking at that, it would be different because international students, is almost, it's a massive number, 42%. But this is a number that I was actually quite surprised. And then, as we will get into it, the minister has talked about their intentions very quietly with the temporary foreign worker program.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I was trying to do some digging because I was trying to figure out where this was announced, and it doesn't seem to have been announced for the temporary foreign worker program, but we'll get to that. It's in the fine print within each of the individual pages.
Yes. All right. Let's talk about these international students, Alicia. So there's been lots of discussion. It was a little over 2 months ago, I guess, when the minister, I guess, dropped the hammer and said, look, we need to reduce by at least a third the total numbers. We know that Ontario and British Columbia are going to be the hardest hit, but I think was Nova Scotia on that list? I can't remember. There's one other province that was likely to expect a reduction in numbers. But for international students, this is they've implemented lots of measures, including increasing the minimum funds that you need to be able to study in Canada, and and to a large extent, even restricting the number of schools that are going to be eligible for post grad work permits, and putting caps overall. But
hmm
do you want to touch on this now?
Yeah, and maybe Mark, you can actually pull up Igor from our firm wrote a really great article on what's happening for international students and specifically with the restrictions on international students, their spouses are not now going to be eligible for open spousal work permits, which is going to reduce how many people want to come here. And also, it's going to reduce immigration's overall numbers on that. So, just like you mentioned, Mark, there's an overall cap for international students. That cap is now going to be allocated amongst the provinces. So every province is now going to have a certain allocation of study permits that they can then divvy up amongst the designated learning institutions within their province. So basically, the federal government is trying to mandate that the schools that are getting those study permit allocations are ones that are credible, that are schools that are of a high caliber and that are not just, I guess he said, the equivalent of puppy mills for turning out diplomas or degrees. So now there's basically a reduction in how many people can get study permits within that province and within that school. And so now we have these provincial attestation letters, these PALs that have to go out. So Igor wrote this article about, also what's going to happen for study permits, open spousal work permits associated with a principal applicant study permit. So now you can't just get an open spousal work permit unless you are coming on a master's or PhD or you are in one of these professions. So dentists, lawyers, doctors, optometrists, pharmacists, vets, nurses, people who have bachelor's of educations or engineering. So if the principal applicant's in there, only in those cases can the spouse apply for an open spousal work permit. So that's a big shift. The other thing that's shifting is that they wanted to crack down on public-private partnership schools. And they had said that they were going to not allow postgrad work permits from public-private partnership schools as of September 2024. They just put a news release out in the last few days saying, oh, actually, we're moving that up and it's going to be May. So as of May 2024, it is no longer going to be an eligible postgrad work permit program if it's a public-private partnership, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
So those are some of the key changes that are happening for international students right now.
One of the things I want to point out is some comments that the minister made in, I'll just share this quickly. This just came out. I didn't get a chance to listen to the whole thing here, but he did appeared on a private podcast. This channel that's got a whopping 668 subscribers. I'm sure they had a reason for doing it here, but essentially this message that the minister has posted, the immigration minister on cutting immigration, one of the very interesting comments he made once again is, that schools need to be prepared. And there was some discussions about how the schools were blindsided, and he said, no, that's garbage. Like they knew since Minister Fraser, that we were going to have to do something about this, and that now they need to basically, what did he describe it as, a come to Jesus moment, and realize that you, as a school, you may have to reduce your programs. You're going to have to tighten your belt. You're going to have to look at focusing on programs that are going to be contributing and producing, workers for the workforce, essentially. And so he said to the schools that, look, we're going to watch what you're doing, even you graduate schools, because right now, a master's, PhD, those programs are not subject to caps. And he said that if they're not happy with how the schools are bringing everything, tightening up their belt and reining in the programs, that they are going to do even more drastic measures in the fall. And he said they will have an announcement, which, I'll be honest, Alicia, I don't think they believe the schools are actually going to do it or be able to do it. I personally feel like they're going to roll something out in the fall once again to further tighten things. And does it have something to do with an election? Yeah, I think it does. Does it have a lot to do with our economy? Yeah, it does. And the housing? Yes, and everything else. And they've really taken it on the chin lately because of the fact that they did not track temporary resident numbers, at least in terms of caps, like they do for permanent residents. And so now they're realizing, and this is something else they've talked about, is that they're going to now institute these kind of levels planning for temporary residents, which only makes sense. It makes sense to do that. So schools you guys need to be on alert, because the way the minister is talking here, he's clearly giving the impression, at least to me, that that he doesn't believe you're actually going to be able to deliver on what they want you to do. And if that's the case, we are likely going to expect further restrictions. And I could even see, in terms of spousal open work permits and things like that, which are also still eligible for master's, PhD, and like we looked at in Igor's blog, that he could easily reduce those as well, as a further disincentive for people to come. And the goal, once again, and I'll share one other thing here, that from the speaking notes, and I think you may have alluded to this before, Alicia, but Minister, there's a reason in his speaking notes he addresses this. Employment is 1.2 million jobs above its pre-COVID, great, but the unemployment rate is at 5.8% as of February 2024. We've done better than recover all the jobs lost during COVID, and now at 130% of that number. And so they're doing good, but they still recognize that there's still people that are looking for jobs, and with a market that's saturated with open work permit holders and things like that, they have to listen. And if the general population in Canada is, whether it's real or perceived, has certain perceptions, you cannot dissociate these decisions from the fact there's an election coming up. And so people need to be aware of that.
Yeah. And we've heard rumblings, Mark, and we'll have to see how this plays out as well. But of course, the federal government is working closely with the provincial governments, and so they are talking more and more about streamlining their temporary resident numbers to economic goals, and that's going to mean PNPs, right? So the PNPs are looking at this and they talk about that, and so most of this is fairly bleak, but we do have a little bit of a ray of hope that's coming later in
Hmm.
this sequence of high points. But one thing that might be the downside is that we've heard rumblings from some of the PNPs that there's probably going to be tightening on
Hmm.
eligibility for certain PNP streams that are linked to education programs within the province. So currently, many provinces have programs where, like, it's an international student stream, or you've gone to the school in that province, graduated with at least a 2-year degree from an eligible institution, and then you can apply for PNP. Well, we've heard rumblings that a 2-year diploma or certificate program is no longer going to cut the mustard, and they're looking at restricting that to potentially a full bachelor's degree. So we'll have to see how that rolls out as well, but for sure changes with schools and students. So Mark, do you want to turn to the next
Yeah.
high point that we're going to
Yep.
cover quickly here?
All right. Okay, QUET visa holders. And this is one that the minister has addressed very clearly. And the reality is, Canada, as he's indicated, would not be too happy if we just said, look, all of you QUET visa holders with work permits, you can no longer extend. And once your work permits expire, then you have to go home. And you know as well as I do, Alicia, that there are very few pathways currently for QUET visa holders to become permanent residents in Canada. And there, if the war in Ukraine is not resolving within the near future, I would be very, very surprised to see the department not extend and offer an ability to extend these work permits for people that are in Canada. And if I slip back here to the messaging, you can see that they talk about the fact that with all of the 300,000 arrivals in Canada essentially by the end of this month, that's what they expect in Canada. They have important global commitments, right? And they say here the commitments are important to Canadians, and Canadians should not be abashed and should unabashedly be proud of this. And at the same time, there should be an honest conversation about what the rise in international migration means for Canada as we plan ahead. So I think they're saying, look, we are in a situation now, and we're going to get to this in one of our later bullet points, but with respect to the QUET visa holders, we're committed to these people. And so the ones that we've committed to, we're going to support and we're going to continue to facilitate. But we're going to maybe give a little sober second thought as to instituting any large scale programs like we have with no caps in these types of circumstances. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, Alicia. Do you think they're going to create a separate PR program for QUET visa holders, or do you think they're going to hold off on that? Aside from
Well,
the family program that's in existence now
yeah.
for individuals who have family in Canada.
Yeah, like they might hold off on it because I don't know if they're going to have room in their federal levels plan for PRs if they create a new category for Ukrainians. And so I'm guessing that they're hoping that if they extend the Kuwait work permit long enough, over the next, so some people have been here for a couple years, and if they extend it for another 3 years, right now people could have extended up until the end of the month for another 3 years. So hopefully these people who are currently in Canada have at least 3 years. And if they can start to get their Canadian work experience up, if they can start to get their English up, I'm guessing that they're hoping there will be some way to scoop from Canadian residents who have Canadian work permits. So it remains to be seen if there will be a specific PR program for all Ukrainians, but there is simply the family one right now. So hopefully, if you are Ukrainian, make sure that you are increasing your language skills. English is so important to make sure that you can get those CLB levels that would make you qualify for express entry. So try to get CLB 5 for everything to qualify for CEC and make sure you get your 1 year Canadian work experience.
So
I do
next
want to
on our
talk
list, yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
do want to talk about LMIA restrictions
Mm-hmm.
because this is something that just got slipped in there, and you'd have to
Yep.
dig down and go to LMIA validity periods. And you will notice that during COVID, LMIA validity periods were actually 18 months. So a company could apply for their LMIA. If they had an approved LMIA, the validity would be 18 months, meaning that a worker can submit their work permit application anytime within those 18 months. It doesn't mean that the work permit duration is 18 months. So just keep those two things in mind.
Mhm.
But what happened with the LMIA restrictions is quietly last fall, or the end of the year last year, they turned that 18-month period into a 12-month period. And then very quietly, as of beginning of May 1st, 2024, that 12-month period is going to go to a 6-month period. And so this is significant because it will mean that companies have to be very spot on their recruitment. They have to have whoever they want for those LMIAs. Some of the companies have had bulk LMIAs where they just have, 5 unnamed workers and they can slot in the employees as they find them. It's going to mean that they have to be quick on the recruitment. And so that anytime they get somebody who's approved on that LMIA, that person has to submit their work permit within the 6-month window. Otherwise, that spot is gone. The LMIA, they'll just lose it. And it does force employers to make sure that they are carefully timing their recruitment efforts and they have rolling LMIAs if they need to have ongoing recruitment.
Mhm. And right now, like we can see that they're posting low wage stream business days processing. I'll be honest, Alicia, I don't know how accurate these are. They
Well,
say for February 2024, we're into March because I've got
yeah.
one myself that is we're over 120 days, calendar days, but we've blown past this. So
And
this is a
we just
interesting.
we just yeah, we just submitted an LMIA with a corporate client on the 15th of March, and they haven't even requested payment yet. And that's unusual. So normally, as soon as you submit your online LMIA, within a day, usually you get a payment request. And they haven't even gotten the payment request. They called the call center and they said, well, there's nothing even on file. So, LMIAs are definitely slowing down, and that might be,
A product.
yeah.
Yeah. And this is what happens, you guys, when the government says we're going to reduce the number of temporary residents. One of the tools they have in their toolbox is to simply not process as many applications, which then results in longer queues. And when you have longer queues, people then decide to self-select. In other words, well, it isn't worth applying if it takes 5 months to get this work permit. As a foreign national, and I'm choosing whether to come to Canada or the US or Australia, and I can get a job offer from, say, Australia, and I'm just throwing this out as an example. I don't know if this is the case, but I can get my permit in a month, and it's going to take 5 months in Canada. Which job am I going to take? So processing times lead to that self-selection every bit as much for temporary residents as it does for permanent residents as well.
And the other thing on LMIA restrictions that's important is that, again, as of May, they are changing the low wage cap figures. And so for LMIAs, there's, of course, high wage streams and low wage streams. Anybody who's on a low wage stream LMIA application, it used to be that the cap, most of the time it's 20%, sometimes it's 30%, but certain industries were allowed to have 30% caps because they were chronic shortages. Now they are reducing the number of industries that can benefit from that 30% cap. So right now you can see we've got a number of industries that can have a 30% cap, sorry, a 20% cap, but they are going to say it was 20, it could be 30 for these industries. Now
Yeah.
only these industries are going to have. So instead of having like a list of 7, we're going to have a list of 3. Only construction, hospitals, nursing, and residential care facilities will be able to have the 30%. Everybody else is stuck with the 20% of their workforce. So this is important too because it means that they are really squeezing which industries can have higher percentages of low wage workers.
Yeah. All right. Possible restrictions for humanitarian and asylum. We hinted at this a little bit, Alicia, but the minister's been clear. Where do you see things going?
Yeah, and so in the speaking notes from the minister, they're talking about climate change refugees, they're talking about global humanitarian disasters, war, and they are saying, well, we have to have some sort of reasoned linkage to who we're bringing in and our economic requirements as well. And so the interesting thing, and I think this is a positive development, is that they are trying to do things like the EMPP, the Economic Mobility Pathway
Mhm.
for refugees. And so they're trying to link internationally recognized refugees, people who are overseas and already recognized as a refugee, with employers in Canada, and then bringing them in under this EMPP stream, which then sets it up for less asylum seekers in Canada or refugee seekers in Canada, but people who are already determined to be refugees basically being placed with eligible employers in Canada, often also within rural programs. So you have communities who are saying, yeah, we're ready, willing, and able to have spots for these people within an economic program, which has hopefully better settlement outcomes. But of course, Canada has international obligations to taking in a certain number of refugees. And so this is this is something that has to be negotiated with international partners as well.
Right. Okay. What has IRCC done so far? Obviously, we've covered quite a bit of this to this point, but you know, where are we seeing the focus right now in trying to reduce?
Yeah, so if they're looking at reducing asylum seekers in particular, one of the big things they've done that we didn't touch on yet was they made partial visa requirements for Mexican citizens. And so that's pretty large because they were doing analysis of what are the source countries for refugee claims, and Mexico was fairly high on that list. And so right away, they put on a visa requirement or a partial visa requirement for Mexican citizens. And that is going to have trickle effects in terms of who's coming in as a temporary resident, potentially who the asylum seeker or refugee claimant numbers or where those are coming from. And they've also, they could also do that on other countries. So they could say, look, we've got a number of asylum seekers coming from country XYZ. We're going to start putting more restrictions on in terms of who can come, whether we're having visa approvals from those countries, right? They can start being more stringent in terms of their criteria. So that's something that definitely is probably going to affect next year's outcomes and numbers.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of next year, speaking of the future, where do you see things going?
hmm So I think everything is going to now be tied policy-wise to what is the economic outcome. So who is going to be able to support that person's work in Canada? So I think hopefully employers, Canadian employers who can really demonstrate that they met a labor market need, that they tested the labor market through advertising and recruitment, they can't find somebody, they can apply for an LMIA, but I think there's going to be higher scrutiny around even LMIAs because there has been some rumbling of fraud that people have been, especially because it's so competitive with express entry right now, those 50 arranged employment points are gold. And so it seems like bad actors have been exploiting the temporary foreign worker program to get an LMIA and then turning around and charging employees to say they have a job offer, which is completely illegal. And I would hope that the department sees that, that is clear fraud. They need to do better enforcement and cut down on the fraud, but it shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You shouldn't be penalizing all Canadian employers because a couple people are being fraudulent. So um, it will, however, mean that everybody, the federal government is going to be working with the provincial governments. They're going to be looking carefully at all of their programs to try to rein things in because we know their overall target for levels planning is to go from a temporary resident number of 6.2% to 5%.
5%. Yeah. Yeah. And as we see here, Alicia, from the minister's speaking notes, he talks about ensuring, a robust pathway to PR for those wishing to make Canada their home in the long term and avoid the pitfalls of an economy built solely on temporary workers. And I think that's what they're seeing now. And the reason they're seeing that is because they've got all of these international students that are here. And they themselves, Alicia, remember, issued those 18-month work permit, those temporary policies for post-grad work permits. How many times did they do it? One, two, people were waiting for a third re-up. And so they've contributed to it. And when
Okay.
it comes to permanent residents, if you then have way, way more temporary workers who are all looking to become permanent residents, well, companies then are going to do what they can to keep them temporarily because they're filling, a position within their company. And so, but this is very telling right here, this paragraph. It means not only setting targets for PR like we talked about, but also for temporary residents. And whenever the target is set, that means that unless you have a true cap on the program, processing times will increase for everything. That's the choke point with temporary
Mhm.
resident applications, unless they put a hard cap and just don't accept new applications. So he said, starting this fall for the first time, we will expand the immigration levels plan to include both temporary resident arrivals and PR arrivals. The latter category is something we're doing already. Yes, they are. So
Mhm.
this is where I think, Alicia, the minister already has his mindset on what he's going to be doing with international students. And I personally think that regardless, I don't think the schools are going to satisfy whatever the minister envisions, and that when they roll out these levels plans in the fall, there's going to be a little bit more of a surprise for schools when they realize that they're going to further cap and further reduce even for professional schools. That's my view. But obviously we don't know, and this is speculation, but this sure seems like it. It sure seems like
Yeah.
that's the direction they're going to go.
And Mark, I think after all
Yeah.
this, we should turn to the one bright point. So the one bright point in all of this is, you know, Minister Miller. So if you go down, we can look at exactly what he said. But he said, you know, as part of our efforts for temporary residents to transition to permanent residency, we will have more domestic draws. So on that paragraph that starts with on the other hand, on another hand at the bottom of the page there. Yeah. So halfway through that paragraph, he says, as part of our efforts, we will have more domestic draws for us. So I assume the federal government, and ask provinces and territories taking part in the PNP to do the same with their allocations. Now, to me, this means CEC draws, right? Like, do a CEC only draw. Make sure that you have some sort of way of bringing in and giving a chance to those who are currently sitting in Canada to transition to PR.
Yeah, which we've talked about, like you and I, every time we go live on our live Q&A, which we're going to be going live after the recording of this, we've talked about the fact that they have, for whatever reason, stopped doing CEC draws. And I'll be honest, Alicia, it just makes no sense to me, with all of the people in Canada, why you would continue to bring new people from outside when they're already here. And as you look at the draws, and if we go back, how far is it since the last CEC draw? We probably have to go back.
September
Yeah,
2021.
2021,
2021. Yeah.
September of 2021. You can see all of these draws, you guys. So
Hmm.
September of 2021. Let's see. And actually, let's see. It looks like it's the 14th, maybe, Alicia. Um, Canadian Experience class right here. Was it September the 4th? Yeah, September 14th, 2021. That's right. So yeah, this is the world we're in, unfortunately. But this could be a bright spot, and we'll have to monitor it and see what happens in the coming rounds of invitations. But I wouldn't be surprised. You know,
Hmm.
so let's see where that goes. All right, last one, Alicia. Practical advice.
Yeah. So, practical advice. All right. If you're in Canada, learn French. If you're in Canada, maximize your IELTS, CELPIP, or the new Pearson test language scores. You want to have maximum points on there. You don't want to be losing any of the points. If you are having a work permit that's going to expire, start talking to your employers right now about doing an LMIA, because it takes 4 weeks of advertising plus probably 3 or 4 months right now for LMIA processing. It's longer than the stated processing times as far as our experience with clients is. And so it's really important to transition to try to get that closed employer specific work permit. It has to be a genuine employer who is doing the right thing. They cannot charge you for going and doing an LMIA. It is the employer's application to make sure that they are asking for the LMIA from Service Canada. So realize right now that things are super competitive. If you are a student and you're eligible for your postgrad work permit, apply right away. If you have a spouse that's eligible for an open spousal work permit because you're a student, apply right away, because some of those things might get taken away.
Yeah, all of those things. And I want to put a little teaser out there, you guys, because I'm going to be doing a little episode on specifically increasing your competitiveness for express entry. And one of the things on my list, and I'll show you why, may very well be, if your employer is not willing to support you with an LMIA, it may be to go home. And in some knowledge-based environments, there might be a possibility for you to, to make arrangements to be able to work outside of Canada. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details here because it can be a little bit more complicated in establishing that you're truly working outside. But this may very well be an option for you as well. So stay tuned for that. And for those of you who see that the light at the end of the tunnel is starting to dim, and you're running into a wall, and that wall has a door, but the door is locked to you, there may be avenues to get yourself some new keys to get in. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more. But this is the future. As Minister Miller releases more information, we'll definitely address that. And as always, if you are in a situation you're trying to figure out what to do, don't hesitate to reach out to Alicia and I and book a consult. There's links in the description below. All right. Thanks, Alicia. And
Thanks,
take care. And thanks so much for listening.